Hi, welcome to Divine Writing, Connections Between Writing Practice, Craft, and Divination. Today, we're hoping to answer the questions, what are divination poetics and how do they manifest in writing practice? Can divination tools such as the tarot and I Ching and throwing the bones influence modes of creation and assemblage? Does the written word have the same generative agency as a reading? When we read the spread or the signs, are we also writing the story? My name is Michele Battiste, and I am thrilled to gather here with 6 writers and divination practitioners who will share the ways in which divination, intuition, and embodied knowledge influence, guide, and disrupt their writing. Because we are a larger group than the usual AWP panel, we're going to move forward in more of a roundtable format where I'll start with a question and then hand things over to the larger group. So I would like to start with some introductions, and I'm going to go alphabetically. Teresa Carmody's writing includes fiction, creative nonfiction, interarts collaborations, and hybrid forms. She is the author of 3 books and 4 chapbooks, most recently, The Reconception of Marie. Carmody is co-founding editor of Lay Fig Press and teaches creative writing at University of Nebraska, Omaha. We also have Megan Kaminski, who's a poet and essayist and the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently Gentlewoman and Prairie Divination, an illustrated collection of essays and an oracle deck. And she did this in collaboration with L.Ann Wheeler. She's professor in English and Environmental Studies at the University of Kansas. We also have Hilary Leftwich. Hilary writes within hybrid and multimedia forms and is the author of 2 books, most recently a hybrid memoir, Aura, and a multi-genre collection, Ghosts Are Just Strangers Who Know How to Knock. She is the founder of Alchemy Author Services and Writing Workshop and Community Coven, and teaches creative writing and environmental writing at the University of Denver, Colorado College, and Unity College. She's been a tarot and bones reader for over 20 years and studies and practices mediumship and psychic skills under various mentors. Kristen E. Nelson is the author of 2 books, The Length of the Scap and In the Away Time, and 2 chapbooks. She's a PhD student and teaches creative writing at UC Santa Cruz. Kristen has been studying divination for 30 years and with Selah Saterstrom runs 4 Queens, a platform for writing and divination. Hoa Nguyen's books include Red Juice, Poems, 1998 to 2008, Violet Energy Ingots, and 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure. She teaches at the Milton Avery School for Fine Arts at Bard College and at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's an Aquarius and a fire horse. Selah Saterstrom works in a Southern family style of card reading and has given professional and community readings for over 30 years. She has written 5 books, including Ideal Suggestions, Essays, and Divinatory Poetics, and Rancher. With Kristen E. Nelson, she runs 4 Queens, offering creative writing and divination classes. She teaches theory and creative writing at the University of Denver. And as I mentioned, I'm Michele Battiste, your moderator today. I write poems and essays, and I just completed my first oracle deck. My most recent book is Waiting for the Wreck to Burn, which won the Louise Bogan Award from Trio House Press. So I'd like to share a little story about the genesis of this panel. About 4 years ago, I decided that I wanted to try to write something that was about the reader, something that created a narrative that the reader could see themselves in, and not just through empathy, but through experience. So I played with forms and ideas on how to do that, like Mad Libs or Choose Your Own Adventure. But I realized that there would always be a story, a narrative framework that the reader would need to fit themselves in. And at first I tried to avoid that. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that there's always a narrative structure or framework that we must contend with. Either we try to fit ourselves in it, or we deny it, or we disrupt it, or we nurture it, or we break it. But that still doesn't mean that the narrative is about the reader. So still the question remains how to do that. And so I turned to my tarot deck and I used the Mythic Tarot by Juliet Sharman Burke and Liz Green. Um, and I turned there not to find an answer, but to find a model. Tarot and other oracle decks are narratives. And when they are read, they are about the reader. And I thought, how does that work? How is writing and reading connected to divination? And how is divination connected to the creation of meaning or accessing meaning? And I'm not a divination practitioner. I tend to think of myself more of a scribe. So I figured, let's gather a group of amazing writers who are also divination practitioners and ask some questions. Let's figure this out as much as it can be figured out. So I'm really grateful to the 6 writers and divination practitioners who are here today, and I'm really excited to dive in. So, Selah, I would love to start with a question to you to kick things off, and then offer it up to the rest of our roundtable. And so it's sort of a kickoff question to start with. What do writing and divination have in common? How do they connect and converge?
Michele, thank you for that question. And I also just want to say a big shout out to my fellow panelists who I adore. And it's an honor to be in this space. And also with thanks to Claire Chambers, the marketing project coordinator at AWP, who has been such a wonderful patient helper with this event coming into manifestation. And Michele, thank you for bringing us together. So I guess I'd like to just begin by approaching your question by kind of giving some context to the terms. You know, what do we mean by divination? What do I mean by writing? What is the tarot card? And this is like the 1 minute, nutshell response, right? But I think, the way that I was kind of brought up to engage with divination was to really encounter it as what I would now call a prayer technology, a willingness, a consensual willingness to engage with the benevolent invisible, which is to say, to choose to abide with the plurality of intensities with the intent of asking and listening. And, I was also kind of raised, my mother was a real influence on me here, to think of divination as a place where one of the most useful responses to any situation is loving curiosity. It's almost sometimes I think there's a gazillion meanings to the cards, but if they had to set on one and sling that meaning on a loop, sometimes I think that meaning would be nothing heals or shifts in a space of shame or judgment. And so divination is a place where we might bring loving curiosity to the ways we've come out of alignment. And it's a place where we might make contact with strategies, paradigms, stories, medicines that can help us step back into alignment with our holiest iteration of self, which does not mean perfect. It just means not numbed out, And so, I think of a card as almost like an archetypal whirl, but in the middle of that, there's a door. And if we can walk through that door, we open into an archive of meanings underwritten by a vast network of catacombs and secret ways. And when the archive of any given card meets the archive of a living body, space opens that supports emergent thinking. And so, you know, I sometimes think of a deck of cards, you know, there's 78 cards in the conventional tarot deck. And I sometimes think of it, it's like a book that it's profoundly unfixed. And so it's always resequencing. The table of contents is always changing. It's a living text. So what is writing? What is divination? What I would say is I may feel them differently, sort of, less and less the older I get. But I locate both activities for me is happening in what I call the field, you know? So both writing and divination are concerned with constellating poignant patterns. They're both are devoted to practices of deep listening to call and response. I think both are about situating yourself in a field of radical flux in a way that is oriented towards liberation strategies. I think that pulses at the heart of narrative. I think both arts believe in the restorative and redirecting power of story. And so anyway, the final thing that I would say is where these invisible technologies converge, writing, divination, is in what I call divinatory poetics. And that is just a space that celebrates the conjunction of these technologies. I find a lot of kinship and discourse around auto theory. I find a lot of kinship in affect, feminist queer affect theory studies. I find a lot of influence at the county dump. Anyway, I'll stop there, but those are some opening thoughts. Thank you so much, Michele, for that question. I'm excited to hear what others have to say.
But Hillary, I think you have a response.
Yes, I just want to echo Selah's words with saying I'm really honored to be here with all of you, and I miss the in-person AWP due to last-minute financial situation. So I'm so happy and grateful to be here with everybody. It's such a, I know we're online, but it just feels like such a warm, inviting space. And Michele, thank you for getting this together. And Claire, also, thank you so much. So my response to the first question is, and I had to think about this quite a bit, but when I think about divination, I think it basically just reveals a belief that there are not just two worlds, but many that are shifting and changing, being born and dying at the same time. And they overlap and they diverge. So writing and divination to me is that they share the same goal, essentially. And that goal is to obtain knowledge through means that are considered unattainable by normal means. And how we define normal varies, even within literary genres, right? But the goal of writing is to both share and obtain knowledge. And that's the same with divination, I feel. And so the only difference I see is with divination, we're dealing with supernatural and spiritual means. And I think we connect these by evoking the same spaces. And that would be like the unconscious, the creative mind that's still alive despite years of adulthood, having us believe that it's all make-believe, that original childhood magic that we all had and still have. But that's what magic is to me, at least, is the childhood magic. And so I think it's just an overlapping a lot. And that's kind of my best answer in response, that they're similar and different in a lot of ways.
Oh, thanks, Hillary. Hoa?
Oh, I was wanting to pick up on something that Selah said about the ways in which, say, a tarot system or a cartomancy system is a whole dimensional set of correspondences that's recombinant and can activate the imagination and can lead to liberatory language and new narrations. Like that for me is like the place that writing and divination meet. And I also think about how writing, like songwriting too. I think of poetry and songs so knitted. And divination practices are ways to engage with oracular time, which that is to say, like the past, the present, the future at once. Like there's no differentiation about it, and to be in that space is a space where transformation can happen, where also you can learn and have new understandings, and also like trust other forms of knowing, which I think is like connected to what you were saying, Hillary, is like to trust that, say, like space that we might experience in childhood that's not as imposed on by the rational real, which wants just to make everything objects and hierarchical and rational and extractable and so on, but instead like can be a kind of transmission of patterns of knowledge across generations too. Like I'm interested in that space, and that there's also a form that devotion, something inside that. And I think I connected to forms of veneration, which is like a practice, like an animist practice that is indigenous to Vietnam, for example. And like they would call it like ancestor worship, but it's really about like dwelling with and like relationships across time. But I think about like veneration and that dwelling with sense of that it's also about like joy. Anyway, but I also just drew a card from this alternative tarot deck that the Asian American Literary Review had brought out. It's like comes in this yellow case, and it says "Open an Emergency" on the back. And the book that in the card that I picked was The Scholar, just here before, and I was thinking about patterns of the book and forms of study and knowledge bearing is also informs this idea of like dwelling with and knowledge across generations.
Teresa?
Yes. So echoing all the thanks to everyone, and Michele, Claire, and all the panelists here. And I had kind of thought about the questions a little bit beforehand and pulled cards, and I'll probably refer to those in some way. But I also got very excited listening to Hillary, Selah, and Hoa speaking right now. And also, Michele, in your introduction, where you were saying that you wanted to have a form where the reader could see themselves, and I want to, and I think about, to me, one of the things that the connection between writing and divination make apparent is that interpretive space of the reader, how the reader is always present in a reading, even if the writing, even if what they're reading is a somewhat conventional novel, say from a person that's considered a canonical writer, right? Their interpretation of that book might be informed by a lot of criticism around it. So there might be pretty set constellations, but in that personal space of reading, there's also, if somebody's really caught in the reading, there's something that the text is showing them about who they are and where they're at that moment in time. And so there's something to me about the way that both writing and divination embody a kind of present tense, but also, as Hoa was saying, that they also embody an oracular time, right? Even if that's not necessarily the intent, because something's always written already, it's read in the present, and also it continues to, has the potential to impact the future, right? So I think about somebody like Octavia Butler's work and all of the work that, like with Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy and and like even the institute that's come out of that, which comes from, the Parable series. And to me, that way where where writing can end up very visibly shifting the imaginative, and to again echo Selah, like liberatory possibilities, is a place also where writing and divination meet. And also that there's always these multiple worlds too. So again, to sort of pick up on something that that Hillary was saying. So I think I'm just looking at the cards that I pulled, which was, I pulled those on Friday, June 16th at nearly 11 a.m. in Mexico City under a waning crescent moon. And that's important because that's that moment that's happening. And those cards, the cards might have been different at a different time, or they could be the same. And that's interesting too, right? And the cards that I had pulled was the Star, the Lovers, and the Seven of Coins. And I think I've already spoken a little bit about the Star, which I was reading that as being a kind of being in a place of multiple interpretive spaces and also in a space of vulnerability. And also that there's a way where like both of these technologies, if we can use that word, like Selah's language, they prompt us to ask better and deeper and more vulnerable questions, right? And if there's something that is blocked, it's never the writing. It's always, or it's never, or if there's something that's veiled in a reading, it's often because there's something that the querent, the person who's the practitioner, needs to kind of work out in order to see the next thing. So I think about that with writing. Sometimes you can't finish a book because you haven't gone through the experience, or you haven't seen what I've come to call the demon thread, something that is in the way of finishing a work. Just like you might have a reading with a practitioner, or you might pull cards and have it might not be clear what it is that you need to see until later, So I'll stop there. I could say more and more, but I'll stop because I want to hear from Megan and Kristen as well.
Thanks, Teresa. Kristen.
Yeah, it's hard to find something brilliant to add after all of these gorgeous practitioners and writers have shared their words. But I think the one thing that I'll, just sort of drop into this collective bucket of understanding is I think a lot about archives lately because of the research I'm doing. But Selah also invoked this image of the archives underneath each card. And I think a lot about the questions I'll get from students, both of writing and of divination, who will say, how can I master this? How can I become an expert at this? And I think one of the things that draws together writing and divination is that they're both practices, right? They're both practices, and you can develop your own personal archive under a word, under a sentence, under a card, under an image on a card. But it's not something you will ever master, right? There will always be more to learn. There will always be a deeper archive and a deeper archive and a deeper part of that archive to uncover, whether it's, in the traditions that you're studying or the individual cards. I've been reading from the same deck since my 15th birthday. I just turned 45. So for 30 years, right? The same deck of cards. And even today I had the pleasure of being in client readings before joining this space, and was able to access new meanings and new archives under the cards. And I think that happens with writing all the time. Here I am earning a PhD, becoming an expert. Where's my bunny ears? An expert in the field, right? But the truth is that there's no way to truly master either of these crafts. There's just a deepening of the experience and a deepening of an understanding of an archive. So that's what I'd like to add.
Thanks. Megan?
Hi, thank you. I don't know if I have a whole ton to add. Everyone has just said so much that's really resonated. I was thinking, and this kind of bounces off of what Kristen just said about both writing and divination of being practices of embracing mystery. And so thinking against mastery, like if you know what you want to say before you write it, or you know the answer to your question, when you're doing a reading, there's not much room for discovery, and there's not much. Those aren't the kinds of literatures that I'm interested in reading most of the time, right? So it's about this process of unfolding and opening yourself to the unknown and the unexpected, and knowledge is beyond maybe even what you'll be able to fully receive, and embracing that. So it's a shorter answer.
Well, if it's okay with you, Megan, I'd love to stick with you with our next question. I think, I hear a lot about sort of connecting to other ways of knowing, connecting to other spaces, connecting to oracular time. And I would ask, how does divination connect us to others? And how can it broaden possibilities for writing and seeing the world differently?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to talk about that. It's something that maybe I know too much about. My South Node is in Pisces, so I'm always, have these dangers of merging. I always want to merge, probably more than I want to. But yeah, I think about, for me specifically, my divination practices are so much tied to connecting to the more than human world around me, and the plants and animals which I share a home, and having that be an access point for knowledges beyond myself, but also a counter knowledges, right, to maybe the ways that we're supposed to do things, or the ways that societally we're supposed to understand the world. And I think that really was the inspiration for making the Prairie Divination deck, was looking to find a home and to find an understanding of myself in place that would allow me to be in good relation, and not knowing how to do that, and looking to the plants and animals around me for knowledge about that, and for ways of connecting. So yeah, think about divination as a collaborative practice. You're always collaborating with someone. And one of the beautiful things about it too is that when you're actively doing a reading for someone else, there's this exchange of energies and knowledges, and it's just this beautiful meeting of all these things. So
Thanks, Megan. Selah, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I just love Megan's response. That's my main thought. I love this idea of how divination connects to others, and just appreciate Megan's insights. I think for me, I just would add, to the chorus here, that I really do feel that divination values collaboration. It is all about risking a different relationship with uncertainty, and collaboration is a powerful vehicle in which to experience that risk on behalf of our most pressing work and biggest life experience. And so, there's also just the way it's a web technology, the ley lines that can shimmer. I think here a lot of affect theory, thinking here of Kathleen Stewart's introduction to ordinary effects, where there's just a potential for emergences to collaborate in worldings and stories that might open up and reframe the whole scene. But I just wanted to add something about the queerness of divination. I've just been teaching a class called Queering Plot, and we've been looking into the guts, the etymological nuances of the idea and the word queer, and and kind of bumping into that place and the tendrils of its etymological roots, where it means oblique or off center. And to me, that really holds a special charge as it relates to divination. Divination is a community art in the sense that it's kitchen table magic. It is about skillful will, repurposing existing resources. And when you go to the cards, it's sometimes because other avenues are not open to you. So it is always an alternative to powerful structures that don't love you back. You know, it's on the side of community, divination is. And so it also, therefore, always critiques whatever the central narrative is, because it's off center of that narrative. It resists necroeconomic tendencies, essentially, as an art. So anyway, I just wanted to add that thought to the mix. Thank you.
I see a lot of nodding heads. Kristen.
Oh, did someone say queer? Happy Pride, everybody. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add to Megan, what Megan was saying and what Selah was saying, and some things that were referenced, earlier, that occurred to me as we're having this conversation, that even this idea of collaboration is queer, right? Like, just like really diving into that, this idea of here we are in our capitalist society that thrives on competition. It really thrives on competition. And who is stronger, who is better, who is more successful, who is richer, who is whatever. And it's like these two technologies of collaborative divinatory and collaborative writing practice, even between writer and reader, right? And between practitioner, diviner, and querent. It's this collaborative experience at all times, which is pretty radically different in terms of how we are taught to communicate under, capitalism and patriarchal structures. So just wanted to add that little exciting thing that popped into my head in that moment. Thanks for bringing that to me, Megan and Selah.
Hillary?
Just bouncing off what everyone said already. It makes me think that silencing people is a really powerful tool. And we all know that's been used over time, reducing our experiences, diminishing us, especially certain communities, the Black communities, the brown communities, women have all been targeted and erased. But when we turn to divination and engage, it allows us to speak within the symbols that we all interpret through our chosen method. And that can be tarot, scrying, mediumship, whatever it might be. And all of these don't have a spoken language necessarily, but they do offer new ways of weaving in narratives into writing, which keeps the possibilities of writing and seeing the world differently alive. And so just like Selah said, it is definitely a collaboration.
Hoa?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this panel and predecessors who likewise had a divinatory relationship to work. So I was also thinking about that in terms of connections with others. I think of Diane de Prima, I think of HD, I think too of like fortune telling practices that were part of the Vietnamese culture, which very specifically would not be shared. And like, I knew not to share that information in a white context because you would be ridiculed. So so it's interesting. So that only drew me more curiously towards practices of divination. I've always been interested in sort of other ways of knowing. And I think in part, like of a defiance, like understanding like that was a form of a structure that meant to diminish. And so I'm excited to hear. I'm excited to hear you to ask this question and to offer these ways of that divination does invite other forms of knowing. It is a form of queerness. Is also, what did you say, Selah? It always interrogates what's dominating, what's central, or is willing to look at it critically, which I think is really important.
Teresa.
Yeah. So everybody said so many amazing things. I'll just add, in a very personal way too. I think that one of the things that both writing and divination can do in terms of connection is it can connect us to maybe lost parts of ourselves, right? Parts that we might that might not feel like it's safe to be there, right? It can make that coming out of these like really angry parts or really wounded parts, traumatized parts. It can make those parts. It can create a safe space, literally, for those parts to be there. It can also, in both writing and divination, it can connect us and to the invisible, as Selah said earlier, the invisible benign. But who that invisible benign is going to be different depending on, your particular positionality, like where you're coming from. So that could be various ancestors, that could be other kinds of deities, or that could be other kinds of, that could be, animals or plants, which aren't necessarily invisible, but to actually be speaking to those parts and listening into something that is not always present in the capitalist, heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacist world that we live in, does make it makes those invisible entities more present. So I think that I think it's a place too where those who have gone before can speak through in both divination or some kind of, practice, a mediumship practice, or as well as in writing. So there's this kind of, there's just so many possibilities that aren't always, they might not always be pleasant too. And that's interesting. Because there's something too about truth speaking. Are you really ready to hear what is going to come through?
Thanks, Teresa. Panel, I'm thinking in my head like, oh, I really want to tell them when this panel is over how much listening to you is impacting me in ways that I wasn't expecting. Like, I'm feeling shivers, I'm tearing up, I'm feeling very emotional about this. And I don't really get those emotions when I listen to a lot of panels. So I just wanted to let you know that it's really reaching me. What you're telling, what you're speaking is just reaching me as someone who's here as a listener and someone who's learning. Teresa, if I can stay with you. You sort of alluded to this, and Hoa also spoke to this a bit. When we talk about our ancestors, the people who've been there before us, right? So, how is your practice writing divination in conversation with your artistic and spiritual antecedents or ancestors? Who do you call on, and who is stepping forward to speak?
Yeah, thank you. So this is, again, something I've thought a lot about. So I appreciate the question. And just briefly, a little bit of context for me. I grew up in a highly, incredibly religious environment, both evangelical and Catholic. I was baptized twice. There was a lot of, and because the home wasn't a pleasant place to be, I would escape to church or any kind of youth club whenever I could. So I was like always going to Bible camps. I was a Calvinette, a missionette, like anything that I could, VBS, and then I became the VBS leader, so anything that I could do. And I went to a lot of different churches and was often really traumatized, by various fear-based messages about hell and damnation and, a lot of shame. And when I started writing, that thing of you shouldn't speak, came up so strongly. In fact, early, like when I published my first book, one of my aunts, so this is like also, it gets into family trauma. One of my aunts actually called and said, how dare you? Like, how dare you write this thing? That was the nice aunt. And so for me, writing has also been a process of spiritual healing, and the method or the means toward that has actually been turning towards something that I was taught was like the worst thing ever, like the worst thing you could ever be in all of the churches that I went to, was a witch, right? And that kind of instruction to disconnect somebody from their own intuitive knowing and from those who have come before you. Michele, when you say I'm getting all of these tingles, I'm like, yeah, because your people, like your guides, whoever that is, they're coming forth and they're like giving you a confirmation, right? And so I mean, I could get into more specific things in terms of like specific projects, like actually, or maybe I will for just a minute. One of the things that I've been working on is a series of essays that thinks about the ways that my artistic antecedents, or some of them, so people, writers that I have been reading for many years, how their work has helped open me to a different way of knowing and being in the world, how their work helped me to come out as queer, how their work helped me to claim myself as an artist, right? And one of those, so I'm talking about artists and practitioners like Kathy Acker and T. Corinne and Audre Lorde, Zora Neale Hurston, and the more Clarice Lispector, and the more I work on these kind of essays, the more there's a ritual component to writing them, where I actually am doing something physically, physical, like I'm making something that might not necessarily even be that might not be actually in the writing, but it's a way of creating a kind of temple or altar space for the writing to come through. And also, in conversation with, obviously like these people's work and their sort of archives as well. So actually visiting archives. And I think about, earlier Selah mentioned, that the archive, that when the archive of a card meets the archive of a body. And also, I just want to pause and be like, I owe so much to Selah Saterstrom. I just want to uplift her. I studied with her. I went to DU so that I could work with her. I can still, like, every time she speaks, I'm like, oh, let me write this down. So again, quoting Selah, like the archive of the body. So also learning to read your body. So paying attention to when those tingles are coming, paying attention to the actual feelings that are manifest in the body when you're reading cards, or when you're reading a situation in the world, or when you're reading a text or a piece of art, actually treating the body as this wonderful source of information that can sometimes also be upsetting, right? But that the body, like all of the elements, is also in flux and in change, and that your nervous systems can be redone. I'm going to pause there because I feel like I've kind of wandered into a little bit of something, but I trust that others will pick up some of these little threads, perhaps.
Thanks, Teresa. Who would like to pick up a thread from that idea, either from what Teresa has brought to us, or sort of the original question of connecting with our spiritual and our artistic antecedents and ancestors, and how that impacts your divination and writing practice?
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, how for me, because I had been like dispossessed of my original language, of my original like land, and had this whole experience inside of a context of a terrible war. There was I had a lot of curiosity about things that were Asian, but that wasn't like very available to me. So I found in a bookstore, and as a teenager, the Tao Te Ching. So that became like a really important like spiritual touchstone for me. And also the I Ching, which I had the Wilhelm one introduced by Jung. And then I went on to study psychology, and Jung became also someone that I turned to. And like Michele, I also have the Mythic deck, the Tricia Newell original illustration version that I picked up in San Francisco when I was also buying something for Diane de Prima, a little Ouroboros on a trivet, because we were going to go visit with her. And you can't come to a visit with Diane de Prima without a little gift, because when you talk about a scholar of the occult, and one who approached like the study of poetry as a contacting with this whole archive and spirits, like literally, you know, being in conversation with Shelley. And that was a practice that she started back in college with her friend Audre Lorde, whose familiar poet was Keats. So de Prima had Shelley, and Lorde had Keats. But yeah, so I have the question about, so thinking about like the Tao Te Ching as like actually the first sort of divination system that I consulted, and you treat it as the sage. It's this book with a sort of like like the tarot, like kind of clouded in some legends, like a turtle brought it on its back, and you can use yarrow sticks. I'm about to get some yarrow sticks at a friend who grew some yarrow plant that I'm very, very connected to. It once like spoke to me in a dream, and in response to like a medical query, a medical quandary really that I was having, and it just like showed itself to me. So it's been like a part of my curiosity for a long time, because I think it's going back to this idea, I think, that was mentioned earlier about like other consciousnesses that are also, that are beyond human, that are also embodied as plants, and other life forms. But anyway, so the I Ching is also like a foundational. It's founded on like a Taoist thinking. And when I wrote 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure, actually I got the title from the hexagram that I drew. And when I sat down to write it, because it was one of those books where I was like, okay, I'm gonna write this book that I've been thinking about for decades. And I turned to the I Ching, and I drew a hexagram that I found actually quite like repulsive. Like I didn't want it. It was thunder on top of thunder. It's like it's actually, I realized later, it's a lot like the tower. And it's like, who wants to get the tower willingly? It's like shock, but it also is like generative chaos. And I realized after I consulted the I Ching 2 extra times, and I got the same hexagram, that I needed to pay attention to what it was telling me, which kind of unlocked and became a kind of emblem throughout the book. So yeah, that's it. Also, I think I'm thinking about how one engages the divinatory practices as part of one's, writing. It's all kind of mixed up in there.
Does anybody have a response to Hoa or Teresa, or want to take the question in a different direction?
I'd just like to add, Sarah Shantz teaches a wonderful workshop. It's called The Aesthetic. And it's all about creating the environment that you want to manifest what it is you want. For example, she's writing about her teenage years, she will create a Spotify list based off the songs that she listened to as a teenager. She'll get images of things that remind her of being in that time and space. And to connect that to this panel and this question specifically is, I think it's also, and also bouncing off what others have said, it's a lot about the aesthetic and creating those spaces, and a lot about ritual too. And I think we can all agree that we all practice ritual in different ways. It can be something really small, like making tea. It can be using your grandmother's collection of recipes from the 40s and the 50s. All of these have divination abilities and ritual within them. And being writers, we all connect those rituals within our writing as well, whether intentionally or not. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing, and to recognize that, that aesthetic that we create in the ritual.
Thank you, Hillary. As soon as you said that, it reminded me of my grandmother's button box. And I don't know if you others had grandmothers who kept buttons. And that was a very ritualistic object for me, to go through those buttons. And, you know, and if you think about how buttons function and you know, all the signification of buttons, it just, and how it immediately brings me back in time. I think that is so right on. God, this hour is moving so quickly, and I would love to sort of finish up with one more question, and I'm going to ask you all to maybe try and answer it in like a minute. So, and Kristen, I'm going to start with you. And I've heard you speak about the Crossroads before, so it is a crime to limit you to a minute, because talk about tingles, but at what crossroads do you find, why don't you give yourself 90 seconds? Crossroads do you find yourself in your writing and in your conversations with the divine? I think I read that correctly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michele, for the invitation to speak about the Crossroads, which, yes, I have talked about a lot. You know, and it's an image that I think all of us invoke, even when we talk about divinatory poetics, right? So when we talk about writing and divination coming together, it's a site of crossroads, which in many earth-based religions, my own traditions, and many of ours here, I'm sure, there's some version of the crossroads that shows up as a place of ritual and petition. So when I speak of the crossroads, I'm speaking about that physical space, but I'm also speaking about it metaphorically as the things that are the potential that's generated when two things cross, right? So two or more roads converge, this convergence. And so I'm thinking, you know, let's invoke Audre Lorde one more time today as a spiritual and writing ancestor. But I think about forms like Audre Lorde's biomythography, right? When she wrote Zami, and I'm thinking about Selah earlier mentioned auto theory as a form, right? And I think about, I spend a lot of time in my writing in those spaces, in those crossroads spaces where the creative and the critical intersect. And I think that divination is also a site of crossroads in and of itself, of the creative and the critical, of the study as well as the interpretation, right? Of a thing, of a message, of an understanding, or as you invoked in Michele in your introductory remarks, as a site of accessing meaning, right? So I think divinatory poetics is a site of crossroads magic. And of course, there's a million more things I can say about this image of the crossroads, but I'd really love for there to be time for the other beautiful humans on this panel to talk about the sites of convergence in their own lives. So I think I'll stop there.
Selah?
I would just add quickly, add to the beauty of this conversation, that I think that writing gives us constant opportunities to practice non-attachment, to relinquish what we thought the work was about, what we hoped it was about, what we all of our efforts to make it be about that thing, and instead surrender that and listen to the visitation that has elected to collaborate with us. And so I think writing is a very Crossroads activities. And I think what the part of the technology I feel at the Crossroads, it's that place where we learn the difference between surrender and abandonment. Sometimes we're afraid to let things go because of our conditioning around, especially as queers and as femmes, whatever, not to abandon something. But I think that what the Crossroad teaches us is surrender isn't an abandonment. It's a moment to go back to this idea that my colleagues brought up earlier of collaboration. It's a place where we recognize our capacity and bring in invisible supportive intensities so that we can move forward. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Selah. Hoa?
Invisible supportive intensities. I just really need to say that. Yeah, I mean, I'm taking my divination practice. Actually, I'm kind of taking my mother's ashes home, and I'm going to visit where she's from. So I'm really doing this sort of like ancestor tour with divination. I found out that her, where she's from is Kenta, and it's in the southern parts in the Mekong Delta, and there is a museum of tarot there. So that I have to go there, of course, and I'm interested in studying, sort of seeing what the Vietnamese expression of tarot is. I've sort of been poking around the Vietnamese oracular community, but there's a language barrier for me. Anyway, so like it's literally a crossroads where I'm also going to be guided by these vintage airmail envelopes that emerged after my mother passed away in 2019, of letters that she received in like 1972 from Kent Hut and Ben Long, which is where I was born. And so I'm going to go to like the literal space, Crossroads, if you will, to do some kind of divination on site, and also do some sort of field recordings and such, and see what happens, and also some research into the archives.
Thank you, Hoa. Megan, Teresa, Hillary? Megan.
I can go. I don't know if I'm cheating on this. Maybe I'm thinking more about being at a threshold than a crossroads, and not quite the same thing. But if I'm thinking about my writing and thinking about my divination practices, and maybe just like my life practices as like these practices of care, I think I'm moving from a place of repair and healing into maybe a place. I'm really thinking, and this is strange for me because unlike you, Teresa, I grew up raised by atheists. I've been thinking a lot about grace, and have just really been moved by the idea, and thinking about, maybe even an environmental ethics of grace, and about not having to earn love. And just, I've been reading a lot of Howard Thurman, and yeah, and thinking about liberatory theology and about possibilities of grace. And maybe that's the place that I'm stepping into with my thinking and writing and everything. So.
Thank you, Megan. Teresa?
Yes. So I love how this conversation has also opened up the idea of the crossroads for me, because I think sometimes with certain terms, I can, or one can get caught in a, like, this is how I understand it. And then it can become more complicated. One of the ways I have understood the crossroads as being a place where you go to ask a question with the willingness to leave something behind, and which is, I think, a little bit of what Selah was saying around, the difference between surrender and abandonment. And the place that I'm at with in terms of both my writing and my divinatory practices is around this question of intimacy, right? What do you need to give over in terms of protective, defensive behaviors in order to have more intimacy with others and with yourself, and also intimacy, that kind of intimacy to be able to hold on to seeing something or speaking something that is true, like your truth, right? How do you, that kind of, that's just, that's where I'm at right now with both of those things. Being willing and able, being able to speak the truth or your truth, feeling worthy of your own truth.
I love that. Hillary, final comment?
Yeah, so I get to be the closer here with all of the great things you all have said. And Megan, I don't know if it's a crossroads or a threshold either, but I love what everyone's already said. And the whole time I was thinking about what Toni Morrison said about literary archaeology. And she talked a lot about unearthing voices that have been silenced, and giving space and writing to those voices that never had a space to begin with. And I love that a lot. And I think it applies a lot to what we're talking about here today. The unearthing can mean a lot of different things with divinatory practices that we all do, which are all different. But also, for me, it's more investigative. And one project that I am working on specifically in relation to this question is researching and falling down rabbit holes about epilepsy, because my son has epilepsy, which I write about in my memoir, but in a very spiritual and supernatural sense, especially. And that's what piqued my interest. And just discovering how historically people thought that people that had epilepsy were able to talk to God. And I think there's some truth in that, right? And so this is just a great writing project to combine the crossroads that we're talking about, and also Megan to, I guess, step on that threshold to begin that journey too. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at in thinking about all of it. And I don't have a solid answer, but I love the process and everything that everyone's talked about.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you all. This has been an amazing discussion. I am at a crossroads here, thinking about space and location, generosity and vulnerability, openness and listening and collaboration. And there's so much. We could talk for hours about this. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, but thank you for joining me to scratch a little bit. Yeah, I just appreciate all of you, and thank you all. And
Thank you all. Thank you, Michele. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michele.
Wonderful, the privilege and joyful. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.